So if you don't know, my name is John Oakes. I run Oakes Weight Loss, where I provide one-to-one coaching services for those looking to lose significant amounts of weight in an effective and sustainable way. People also come to me specifically for help with emotional eating, even if they don't necessarily need to lose weight. People come to me primarily because of the popularity of my minute-long TikTok videos, which kind of amazes me that I've had this much impact with such short little snippets of content. So today is probably the first time you're ever hearing me speak live, or it may be the first time you're ever hearing me speak for longer than a minute or 2 minutes. While I'm amazed at how much impact I've had, the truth is I have so much more to share. And TikTok is frankly a little bit frustrating because I can only share like some ice shavings off the top of the iceberg and serve you a snow cone. And today we're going to get a little bit more below the waterline. Still not full iceberg, not even close. But that's why I'm super excited to be here with you today, where we can kind of gather together in a class setting. So I've titled today's presentation, Out of Control, How to Stop Emotional Eating Without Self-Control. So the goal of this presentation is to answer a couple of questions. Why do we so commonly fail at behavior change despite badly wanting to succeed? What has society conditioned us to believe about creating behavior change? And why hasn't this paradigm worked for us? Specifically, I want to cover why it isn't your fault and why it's been preventing you from changing. And then at the end, I'm going to share a novel approach to lasting behavior change. Basically, I'm asking, what operating system are we running, and does it need an upgrade? If you don't know, I have a PhD in social and economic geography, and this kind of helps you understand a little bit of my background and why I maybe think differently about fitness than other people. I have, of course, had my own struggles, my own journey, but I also just have developed a different way of looking at the world. I studied change over space at differing scales. You know, a historian studies change over time. Geographers study change over space. And I did so specifically in the context of social and economic theory. My applied focus was human migration. And one of the big things that came out of my dissertation was this idea of a cultural delusion, which in this case was affecting the migrants I was working with, where a central narrative of the culture does not match the reality. And this ends up forming little subgroups of that culture that are trapped in getting the short end of the stick of this delusion, the shared delusion of the culture. Basically, as soon as the plane touched back down in the United States, my mental health started tanking. Was it related? I don't know. But it was very clear that I wasn't doing so good. And, you know, I finished up my PhD, moved on into other areas of life. I'm starting a family and stuff. And what could have been the best years of my life just turned into a slow rolling descent into hell. Things actually hit their worst point in 2018 when my brain had a total meltdown. And you may notice here that I began to lose weight in that same year. So John, you're telling me that when your brain was going completely half psychotic, that's when you started losing weight? Yeah, it doesn't make sense, does it? That's sort of the point of this presentation. So 2018, I woke up one day in a near psychotic panic attack that didn't stop for about 2 months. And it came back, hit me with aftershocks every single day, multiple times a day for a year and a half afterward. This also had been manifesting beforehand in physical pain, chronic pain, shooting pains, like things that are a bit like neuropathy, but not neuropathy, stomach aches, headaches, terrible migraines. Couldn't even sit up in a chair, couldn't stand for very long. I was mostly bedridden or couch ridden. Couldn't sleep, I had to work laying down. I was more desperate than ever to lose the weight though, because my size was a factor in making all these things worse. But whatever method I used to let go of emotional eating or trying to get myself to work out again, none of the old normal tactics worked, because anytime I went anywhere near them, they would all severely trigger my psychotic panic episodes to where I'd just be basically a trembling shell of myself. So self-control, discipline, willpower, effort, trying harder, self-criticism and judgment, all forms of cajoling and forcing and anything I could try. I tried it, and none of them, I just couldn't do them. So this forced me to find a path that somehow didn't involve adding expectations onto a already severely overstressed system, the need to be perfect before I could make progress, or to be able to perform well, or waiting for my circumstances to be friendly enough, because that wasn't going to happen. That at least was one good thing about the crisis I was in, is that it totally dissolved the delusion that maybe I should just wait till things kind of, oh, life's, it's too busy, it's too hectic right now, I should wait till later. And I was able to see through that, fortunately. That was the one positive. In less than 2 years, I lost 200 pounds, almost 200 pounds, 196. It took it was October of 2018. And then about that time the next year, I took a break. This was started because my gallbladder exploded and was dead and rotting inside of me. And most people at the first tremor of a gallstone would have gone to the ER. But I was so riddled with severe pain that I thought it was just another day in the, adventuresome and wonderful life of John Oakes at that time. And so I ended up in the hospital, and that caused me to, I was already thinking about taking a break, and that kind of settled that. And then I ended up having a mental health relapse, still not exactly sure why. But then at the beginning of 2020, I started up again, and I finished my program. And during that break, I did not gain weight. So when I was actually on program, I never missed a single workout. I never overate. I never deviated from my patterns. How? How is this possible? There are a couple factors that practically made it more possible. Number one, I did have a smart game plan. I've learned a lot over the years about how to lose weight in effective ways. And I'd struggled like everybody else, multiple attempts, losing weight at different periods of my life. I had previously lost 100 pounds before I had to, lose 200, because I obviously gained that 100 pounds back and then some in that time when my mental health was tanking. And I knew I had nowhere else to go. I knew that no matter how frustrated I was, and I was beyond frustrated, I knew I had nowhere else to go. I knew that going back was basically a death sentence. And there were pros and cons to that. Obviously, it kept me going, but it did cast a pall of panic onto my journey, which ended up causing me a lot of suffering. John, I thought you said that you didn't use discipline or self-control or any of that. How did you end up seemingly being that way? Well, somebody looking from the outside that would be the only conclusion they would come to. But my experience was that anything over here on the control side of the spectrum was completely cut off to me. I could try, I could get close, I could start to try to be more heavy-handed with myself, and maybe I could do it for a day, right? But it was so physically and emotionally painful to me that it would force me away from that end of the spectrum. And then every time I fell into despair and hopelessness, I'd lose faith, drowning in my hopelessness, dragging through my workouts. You get higher hunger, everything gets harder. And I'm like, well, I can't quit. And this is making it harder. This sucks too. This is its own kind of pain. And so really I was vacillating between these two ends of this spectrum of pain. And it forced me to stay in this extremely uncomfortable middle ground. And you may be saying like, well, John, if both ends of the spectrum were painful and the middle was uncomfortable, how did that work? Well, it sucked. It was awful. And there's a reason I don't hold up my weight loss journey as the model for anyone else to follow. I wouldn't wish it on my worst enemy, quite frankly. But because severe pain forced me into this uncomfortable middle ground, it basically dragged me kicking and screaming through a learning process that God or the universe, I think, wanted me to go through. And I found change in that medium space, that middle ground. And it got me thinking. After a while, after I'd lost, 50, 60, 70 pounds and started to get my head around it a little bit, I realized, wait a second, I don't have to feel good to change. I've lost huge amounts of weight and I've been miserable this entire time. How does that's never happened before in my life. I didn't have to feel in control in order to do good things. This was another big conclusion. And this rocked my world. I couldn't get my head around it. Like, how do you make good things happen when you're suffering without controlling yourself? I also learned that I could feel stress, despair, pain intensely and still move forward. I didn't know at the time that the situation was forcing me to, if I wanted to live, I needed to increase my willingness to be with and feel these feelings when they did come up. At one point, I heard a term, somebody say the phrase flow of life, describing their ethos of how basically, that's the way you succeed in life, is that there's a flow to things and you should go with the flow. And this idea of flow, it really struck me. And after a while, I was like, yeah, I think that's a good explanation of what I'm experiencing in this very uncomfortable middle ground. Because clearly it was getting me results, but clearly I was resisting it extremely. And I thought, well, gee, if I'm sitting here in this terrible result of years and years and years of undiagnosed PTSD, untreated depression and anxiety, then the opposite way of living, then that should feel foreign to me. It should be hard for me to get my head around this, because clearly I need something that is very different from where I've been coming from. And I just started to get more and more fascinated by the idea. I started learning how to meditate, and yeah, it just changed my whole perspective on the process. And it really pointed out to me that so much of my subjective suffering, you could say, of the process was preventable. It had a lot to do with the way I interpreted things at any given time. So the reason that we would look at my success and assume that it was based in the main modus, the primary component would be discipline or self-control. And that's because we have a central cultural assumption that successful people are successful because they are self-controlled and disciplined. They work hard, they sacrifice, right? Work, not play. And of course, this has been transmitted to us in the form of advice on emotional eating. Use self-control, be more self-controlled. Stop having such a good time, right? This sort of paints emotional eating or overeating as settling up at a buffet of pleasure, as if that's really what the experience of being a chronic overeater is like. You have to deny pleasure to have health, right? You can't have your cake and eat it too. And of course, this is where we get things like you need to want it bad enough. So when discipline fails us and we come back and say, hey, this isn't working, somebody says, well, clearly it's you, right? It couldn't be discipline. Couldn't, because our culture just leaves it completely unquestioned. And it causes us to project that onto other people, which continues the cycle. We are part of the cycle that keeps us all stuck in this cultural delusion. Every time we see someone be successful, you see Sally come to work and have her healthy meal prep in a Tupperware, and you think, oh, geez, how can I be more disciplined like Sally? Meanwhile, Sally may not be doing that from a place of discipline, and we'll get to that. And so we further these associations in our own minds without basis in objective reality, basically through assumption. And you know what happens when you assume? You create delusions. So this control paradigm, the discipline delusion, the self-control paradigm for change, is so prevalent in our culture that its routine failures go completely unexamined. Instead, every failure of self-control is seen as a failure of your character rather than a failure of this mechanism itself. It keeps self-control as this unattainable standard to keep chasing. It's this golden ring that we're all reaching for. And it couldn't be this vaunted cultural value unless it was so unwieldy, unless it was so hard for us to do, and so few people could do it. This is why people, when they make a big show of being disciplined on social media, what they're doing is saying, see, I'm doing this thing that very few people can do, therefore I have high status. And in a sense, I am better than any of you who are not currently being disciplined or making a show of it. A lot of our motivation, our interest in discipline starts to be partially because it's this constant, like the standard that we're chasing, it starts to affect our worth, our status, and our self-esteem. So when we do sort of eat well for a couple of days, part of the good feeling we're having there is that we're giving ourselves permission again to feel self-worth and self-esteem, because we're not so actively crapping all over ourselves, to put it bluntly. And so this means that discipline and self-control culture are actively working to pour shame onto those who are most in need of compassionate assistance and healing. And my contention is that it is not you who have failed at self-control. It is the self-control paradigm for change that has failed you and all of us. And up till this point, none of this has been our fault, but if we're going to change it, it does need to start with us as well. And I'm going to show you how to heal emotional eating, not just without self-control, but by getting out of the delusion of control and into a better reality, i.e., just plain reality. So I'm going to break down a little bit why self-control has failed you in the past. I could go off on a tangent on any one of these things and talk about them individually for an hour, but we're just going to have to survey it for the sake of time. We'll have other opportunities to dig in deeper. I'll tell you more about that at the end. So automation is our superpower. You ever notice people, when they're giving health and fitness advice, they say two things incredibly commonly. You have to be self-controlled, and you also have to create good habits. Anybody see the inherent contradiction in those things? Our habits are based in our automation. They do not require cognitive control of our behaviors. In fact, they're there to free up our cognitive control to think about other things. So when we have habits, the express purpose is to not require our frontal lobe cognition, our executive function, to do it. So it frees us up for other tasks, right? This is one of our huge evolutionary advantages over other animals, why we have language, cars, why we can do so many work tasks. The least capable human being you've ever met has more ability to catalog motor skills and routines than the most amazingly smart animal on the world today. And some animals have an ability to, like go on 200-mile migrations or 3,000-mile migrations after somebody shows them how to do it one time. That's a different kind of pattern recognition. But still, overall, these parts of our brains, the basal ganglia, is far, far more developed than in other animals. So this is what makes us great, the ability to not have to think about everything all the time. So we can think about higher order tasks like problems to be solved. And when we are being self-controlled, that is a thing, right? We are tapping into our executive function. And our executive function is a limited resource, right? It's replenished by rest, specifically sleep. We're topped back up, hopefully, in the morning. And it runs dry by the end of the day, especially if you've had a more stressful day. This is why you're more likely to overeat, overindulge on anything, or fall into any compulsive behavior in the evening hours. And this is exacerbated for people with PTSD, non-neurotypical cognitive makeup. And so when our executive function runs dry, hypervigilance starts to take over, tunnel vision, right? All those mechanisms of forcing it. The reason they were triggering me in my PTSD-induced, psychopanic was because all of these things, they stimulate the fear centers, the alarm centers in our brain. When we're exercising control over something, it's easy for our brain to say, well, we have to exercise control because if we're not doing that, we're in danger, right? And so this shuts down large parts of our brain. Again, I would love to go into the neurology. It's nuts of how much of your brain just goes dark when you're having these, emotional memories, flashbacks, whatever it is, or just when this part of your brain gets a little too heated up. But basically, to put it very simply, self-control makes us terrified and dumb. Hard to make good decisions in that state. The other major reason it's failed us is that self-control only works in foresight. It requires prediction. Your ability to enforce self-control heavily requires on your ability to predict the future. And if we've all experienced this in some form or another, you can make the meal preps, you can do this, but then something comes out of the blue that surprises you and you hadn't planned for it. And now the whole apparatus falls apart. If you haven't noticed though, no human being is very good at predicting. So when we have a mechanism for change that requires prediction or heavily relies on it, then we're setting ourselves up for failure. Also, this only works if you can recognize the compulsion building before it's too late. And by too late, I mean the sort of critical mass, the point of no return that every compulsive behavior has as it builds and builds and builds before you act on it, right? We'll talk about this a bit more later, the way time it gets involved with the lead up to the actually doing and then the after the fact of compulsive behavior. And it's very difficult to notice this window where we could possibly divert our behavior before the semi truck has completely slid off the icy road into the ravine. You know, sometimes people on TikTok ask me, how do I stop in the middle of a binge? And the answer is the same as how do you stop a semi as it's careening off the side of a ravine? I mean, start shopping for a new semi. But luckily for us, if we, take down a whole bag of chips and we don't feel good about it, usually that's not catastrophic in one dosage. The danger of these things is in how they add up over time, right? And this will also come into play when I talk about solutions later on. So we end up having this tiny window to notice what's happening, to notice that we've been triggered, stress has been building, and we are headed for the cliff edge. Otherwise, we fail. You can see that self-control creates win-lose scenarios, pass-fail. Considering the difficulties present, this destines us for failure at very high rates. It lowers confidence and self-trust. Because when you're being triggered by something, you're probably at work, you're busy, you're distracted from that in a normal way, not even in an avoidant way. There's just lots of stuff going on. How reasonable is it for you at this point in your life when you understand very little about these compulsions, where they start, where they go, how they get there? How can you really be expected to be able to notice early in the process? Yeah, and these continued failures erode our self-confidence and they erode our self-trust. We start to not be sure, wait, if I'm having a compulsion, is that me actually talking to myself, or is that, the bad voice? Is it God or is it the devil, right? And when you start having that conversation, it's chaos. You cannot trust your intuition, your true self speaking to you. You can't connect with your values. It's a bad situation. And this leads to warped perceptions of reality, taking us more and more out of our grounding. And this leads to conditional self-love, conditional self-worth. Like I said before, how we end up pursuing self-control and pursuing discipline like sad little puppies, following it around, because we don't just want to heal our physical situation. We also just want to feel good about ourselves. We want to end the constant lack of the vacuum of self-love and self-worth that this process has led us to, all of which leave us more susceptible to compulsion. And the cycle continues. There are also some inherent philosophical, logical contradictions within the idea of self-control. Because if a being can look after its own well-being, can look after its own interests, it's not in need of control as an apparatus to do that. It can do that as an expression of self-love and care, or just following its best interests, doing the things it wants to do. If a being cannot do this, it would indicate that it's either created with this flaw, which how can you expect it to contain the ability to heal itself when it was created this way? Doesn't make sense. If it was not created this way, then it indicates that something created a schism or fracture, or is actively continuing to create it. This all fuels inner conflict because self-control, when it sees a fracture or a schism, it says you must identify the good part and now strengthen it to subjugate the bad part. right? It's all this, like, we need to intervene in this foreign war and we got to figure out which side we want to support to advance our interests. It's like, wow, that's messy in real life, and it's equally disastrous when we do it inside of us. Because the truth is, if you were originally a unified whole person, this good versus bad setup, it just sows further division. It actively prevents healing from ever happening. You're not going to get within 100 miles of healing. And it just pours gasoline on this civil war that's probably been raging inside of you for years, decades. And this is why most people deal with their binging or their emotional eating when they're alone, right? And I found this out by surveying my audience vastly. The situation that correlated with emotional eating wasn't social situations, it wasn't stress situations, it was being alone by a huge margin. And it makes sense. Why? Because when you're alone, that's when you are most, I guess, stuck in your own inner conflict. So if we try to think of, well, gee, if all these things don't work, what could work? Well, let's look at how a physical bone would heal. First off, you would need to accept that you are in need of treatment, that you can't just walk this one off. You know, Steve is trying to say he's okay, but we can see the bone sticking out. We're going to the doctor, right? So then you go to the ER and the doctor will do an examination. They will do imaging. Why? They need to see. They need to see as clearly as possible what's going on so they can tell what's broken, where, how, possibly what they can do as a competent professional to set that bone for you. And then there's immobilization, stillness. Once the doctor screws in those screws and plates and pins and rods, now you just hang out. You just got to keep that bone from moving around. You have to rest. You have to be still. You have to be patient. And this creates the context where healing can happen to you. Healing is not an active verb. Healing is passive. And any activities we undertake in that context fall under the umbrella of nurturing. These are things we do to protect this space of healing. I want to zero in on especially that part of the process where we tend to not have any clue what we're doing wrong or not. And that's the seeing, right? A lot of us, we're not allowed to accept that we need to go to the doctor because we don't know how to see. We're not willing to look down and admit that something's broken. Because of the delusion of discipline, we keep trying to walk around on a broken leg. And every time we fall down, we're like, there really is something wrong with me. It's like, no, there's not something wrong with you. You have a fracture that needs to be set. And those are two very different things. One is about your essential makeup, and one is about your physical state at this moment. But especially when it comes to seeing what's broken so that it can be healed, this is what I call the art of seeing. And this is important because our breaks don't usually come from a physical injury. They come from traumas, bad days, bad years, bad times of life, when certain negative beliefs, invalid logical conclusions got formed that slowly over time have acted as duct tape, bubblegum fasteners that hold this scaffolding of survival mechanism together. And awareness of a lie dissolves its power. So in this case, when we take our x-rays, when we're able to fully see an injury, we're going to start to see the lies that are holding it all together. In our case, the healing doesn't necessarily come from a bone being knitted back together. The healing, this cat, crazy kitten, sorry. So in our case, the healing doesn't come from a bone knitting back together. It actually comes from the false self, the false apparatus of survival, slowly crumbling apart because we are undoing the lies that are joining it together. And now she's playing with the headphones. I cannot win today. See, I was worried about technical difficulties, and then now I have kitten difficulties. People probably want to see the kitten. Hey, she won't let me grab her. So awareness is a key aspect of powerful passivity. And awareness leads to change because it is neutral. Awareness is value neutral. When you're seeing something truly, you are not bringing meaning. You're not forming interpretations. You're not bringing judgment. You're not criticizing. You're just observing. Neutrality is not concerned with good or bad, only with what is. Awareness is focused on reality. It grounds us and our emotions in objective reality, as opposed to being grounded in subjectivity, interpretation, our emotional memories that pop up, i.e. flashbacks, or our delusions, our kaleidoscope of delusions. So am I saying that not having an opinion can help us heal? Yeah, that's exactly what I'm saying, because it minimizes the scale of delusional misperceptions of reality, but also the emotional significance of any misperceptions that would intimidate us into feeling the feelings that are triggering these emotions, right? So for instance, we feel sad, let's say, and we feel great discomfort at this, and now this elicits a fear response because we associate sad with danger, right? So if we can feel through the fear, we can feel the sadness, and this can process and be stored in our long-term storage. And when we're able to feel our feelings, this allows us to learn valuable information contained in the emotions once we feel them. And it allows lower consciousnesses to learn from the higher, i.e. growth, evolution, expansion of the consciousness, right? And these are obviously big ideas, and I would love to dig into them more, but I don't have time right now. Basically, get this though, when you are being more aware, that space of awareness is not awareness if you are judging yourself or criticizing what you're seeing. Therefore, as you learn to be aware, you learn acceptance, and you sanitize this space of criticism and judgment. In this way, awareness is a very important precursor to self-love. Not only because we cannot love that which we're not able to see or that we refuse to see, but when we have been living in a constant thrumming, drumming, self-recrimination, judgment, criticism, simply turning all that off by being neutral is a massive step in the right direction. Very importantly, awareness works in hindsight, not in foresight. This provides valuable clarity on the thought structures and thought patterns leading up to an emotional eating event or binge, during it, and after. This does not require perfection or performance or success in these pass-fail setups. It only requires willingness and presence. And awareness learns more from failure, quote unquote, than from success. Which means the more you're failing, the faster awareness is able to learn and help you dissolve whatever's going on. It's a yin and yang type of relationship. And awareness removes failure, operative concept, because of what I've just discussed. When it's no longer possible to fail at emotional eating, this reduces the stakes around it. It helps reduce the emotional significance and reduce the ensuing self-judgment, self-criticism, and self-worth issues that keep us stuck in this cycle of compulsive behavior. And as I mentioned before, awareness drives change because it reveals the role of shame in upholding our compulsions. Shame is not an unfortunate byproduct of doing something bad. Shame is not you feeling bad about what you did. Shame is a part of the compulsion apparatus saying, do not look at the man behind the curtain. You're not allowed to look at this. The reason it gives you is that you're such a horrible piece of crap. But the real reason it's doing it is because if you looked a lie, once you see it for a lie, it has no power anymore. And whatever it's holding up will crumble. And that applies to the invalid logic that also lies at the heart of compulsion. Why? Because compulsions are formed during what kind of times in our lives? The really, really good times or the desperate times? Desperate. What kind of logic do we come up with in desperate times? Not really good logic. So not only can awareness drive change, awareness is actually required for change, especially if we're talking about lasting long-term change, because we cannot change something we don't influence. We cannot influence that which we do not understand. We cannot understand that which we're not willing to examine. We cannot examine that which we do not see, and we cannot see something we haven't even noticed or haven't noticed yet. This is what I call the ladder of awareness. We start down here in the bottom, in a place where a lot of you are right now when it comes to this aspect of your life. But if you think about it, in other aspects of your life, you've ascended this ladder before. And this is why it makes such a great tool, because it provides direction for this process, but in a way that you can link up to other experiences in your life. There's sort of an intuitive nature to it once you get the hang of it. But it also, if things do get confusing, if, this emotional work can be, you can find yourself in that dust cloud from time to time. This is going to provide that framework that systematizes an amorphous concept and grounds it in practical steps for building awareness. It works in willingness and presence rather than perfection and effort. It works in reverse chronology rather than requiring prediction. And remember, hindsight. We don't predict very well, but hindsight is 2020. The ladder of awareness builds compassion. It rebuilds our self-trust and autonomy. And this is huge. Don't skip over the rebuilding of self-trust and autonomy, because this in so many ways is the end of the road that allows you to create lasting change in whatever aspect of life you want to. And it prevents future delusions from forming. And that's specifically something that happens after we develop this self-trust and autonomy. Put simply, if you ascend the ladder of awareness in regards to a compulsive behavior, you are knitting together the fracture, or in this case, you're taking apart the scaffolding of that compulsive behavior. And you're not just throwing affirmations at it. An affirmation, so often when we're dealing with severe issues like this, an affirmation is like tossing a spark plug into a broken motor and hoping that it installs itself. It gets us away from Band-Aid solutions, thinking we just don't want it bad enough. But we're working with reality and with the flow of the reality around us at any given moment, and we're not having to construct a reality. This is not dogmatic. This is not about, come live on John's compound and wear these special robes and give me all your money and name all your children after me, right? This is just, all we're talking about here is reality and how to get there. And obviously constructing a reality, being beholden to dogma is incredibly exhausting, because then anything that comes and offends your dogma is now a threat to your worldview, therefore an ontological threat to your existence. This is why people freak out when you question some of their more deeply held beliefs. So, Carrie, if you're watching this, I'm sorry for the graphics here. Carrie helps me with my graphics sometimes. I did not reach out to her for this presentation, focusing more on substance here, not so much form. But I wanted to give you some kind of visual to help you see what this could look like in a 2D representation. Normally, when we're shown some kind of graph, we're used to seeing progress represented by upward movement to the right. But here we actually start in the bottom right-hand quadrant, usually only having awareness after the event, right? That's often where we start. You might have more awareness for earlier in the process. That's great. It moves you through the process that much faster if that's where your starting point is. But for a lot of people, they don't realize they've been overeating consistently for days or weeks until they get on the scale finally and they're 5 pounds heavier and they're like, oh, okay, now I'm going to actually notice the things I've been doing. They've been passing me by without being noticed. It's that Ford Taurus that's passed you a million times, but then your friend says, I'm going to buy a Ford Taurus. And all of a sudden you start seeing Ford Tauruses everywhere, right? That's what happens when you begin to notice. You signal to your brain that, hey, this might be important information. Please filter it into my consciousness rather than filter it out for my own benefit. And your awareness can start to work in hindsight backward through the process. Right here, after the fact, this might be 10 minutes after the fact, where you're coming out of your fugue state. covered in Cheeto dust. And maybe you're still feeling the discomfort, and that can make it more visceral when you utilize your awareness to look at what you had done. I'm going to go through these chronological stages here really quickly. Obviously, we have our trigger, the event that set off our stress response. Stress A is that part of the stress when I described it earlier, when we're doing other stuff, we couldn't really notice that there's too much stress going on. I mean, you can notice if you get way to the end of this process for sure. But most people, practically speaking, who haven't practiced this type of awareness, they're not going to see it coming. They usually don't see it coming at all. But then stress B is that window where we might be able to notice, hey, my heart's beating really fast, or I'm thinking about hurting people, or I'm starting to think about food, right? Whatever it is, where you're not fully at full tilt boogie, but you're definitely able to notice, hey, something's up. Stress C is that part where we have reached critical mass. We're starting to dissociate. We're starting to be less and less and less present in our reality. The acquisition phase, this is when you're getting on DoorDash. This is when you're ordering the pizza. This is when you're driving to the store. This is when you've deviated off course as you're driving home from work and you're hitting the drive-through. And obviously these two phases often intermingle. Then we start eating. Phase 1 is eating to satiety. Phase 2 is eating past satiety to where we're actually physically uncomfortable or feeling pain. And then the third phase here that I listed out is when we're eating well past discomfort into just hurting ourselves. We're not having a good time and we don't really know why we're still doing this. And then ex post facto, after the fact. So now look at that. See, I was saying I didn't have graphics. Look at this. I know, it's like, wow, in 1996, this would have been really top-notch presentation. So basically, we want to move up and to the left, right? We want to be able to work back in time until we're able to develop higher levels of understanding, higher levels of influence and change at earlier stages of the process. And actually, if you think about it, this upper right-hand quadrant doesn't really apply. That doesn't really make sense. But I only really realized that after I made the graph. So, oh well. For instance, you might get to a point where you're able to notice that, hey, I'm at the window, but you don't have the apparatus to do anything about it yet. But you're starting to notice. You might see it at the window. And now, if you are present to it, if you use your awareness, this is how you can start to examine it at a deeper level, right? An examination next time around will eventually lead to understanding. You're going to see how the parts are moving, how these things are interacting with each other, what's moving what, which can give you a clue as to how to affect the movement of these things, how to affect the pattern of these thoughts and the rising of the stress. And obviously, eventually, if you get here, this is where you start shutting this stuff down in a major way, because you're starting to catch it before you're really dissociating, when you can still recruit your presence, you can still recruit a little bit of focus, and you've now built up this organic understanding and ability to influence that for every person in every given situation, this might look differently. So I don't have a ton of examples off the top of my head, but now you can change. And ideally, you can actually start to become aware of the triggers as they're happening. You get that email and you're like, I've read the first sentence and I'm already aware that I need to be on guard. That's when you're like Radar from the show MASH. Radar could hear the helicopter coming before anybody else. And that's obviously a good place to be. However, you can start to alleviate some of the severity of your compulsive behaviors earlier in the process, right? You might not be able to stop an eating episode, but by trying to be more and more present in these stages of eating, maybe you stop at discomfort rather than really hurting yourself. Maybe you stop at satiety. Yes, you ate something you wouldn't normally want to eat. Yes, you ate something that is going to make you feel gross, but maybe you just fill up on it and you don't actually start to feel overfull. I could teach an entire course just on this, but I need to wrap up. So I want to just summarize what we talked about today by comparing very quickly self-control and awareness one last time. Self-control deepens divides. Awareness reunites us with ourselves and removes divides. Self-control judges our injuries as flaws and moral failings. Awareness recruits compassion for our injuries and even the very survival responses that help to build our compulsions to begin with, because these, after all, were just pieces of us frozen in fear during the worst times of our life. It's very easy, once you have the awareness, to be compassionate of that self or that aspect of yourself. Self-control leads us toward hypervigilance, stressing ourselves out, making us scared and dumb, right? And these are why we burn out. And this is how we build obsessive behaviors. There's a lot of talk about obsession, but if you're not seeking to control something, you cannot create an obsession. Something to really think about. Whereas awareness operates via passivity and peace, and it is very low effort. It's something you can practice and get better with at time, but it does not take a lot of effort. You're not going to be burning a lot of brain calories doing it. Self-control strengthens our compulsions. Awareness dissolves them. Self-control identifies emotions as dangerous and tells us to resist them because they could be a threat to our self-control. Whereas awareness allows emotions to be seen, felt, and processed, which will prevent those emotions from popping up in your face as easily next time around. Self-control creates win-lose scenarios. Awareness is neutral to the outcome. Self-control promotes failure via the low percentage of victory and these win-lose scenarios. Whereas awareness uses failure, I'm skipping ahead, but removes failure as an operative concept. In that sense, it might also remove success as an operative concept. How can that be a good thing, John? Well, I wish I had an hour to tell you. Self-control relies on prediction. Awareness relies on hindsight. Self-control demonizes our failures, our eating events. Awareness utilizes them to help us heal. The more you need healing with awareness, the faster you're able to heal. Yin and yang. Self-control encourages and feeds on criticism. Awareness sanitizes the mind of criticism and judgment. To recap, powerful passivity is superior to the paradigm of self-control and delusion, or discipline delusion, and it helps us work with the nature of reality and time to create healing and to advance our interests. Awareness is a key feature of powerful passivity, and we can use the ladder of awareness as a conceptual framework for growth, healing, and lasting change. So that's gonna end this webinar for today. Stick around though, I have some other things to talk about. As you continue down this path of awareness, right, it's gonna come in one of a few ways. There's the self-guided, right? Meditation, journaling is what I had because I didn't have other resources, though I did have therapy, and having a trauma-informed therapist saved my life. I went to a different therapist in 2016, a psychologist, just literally stared at me for 6 months, basically a walking billboard for untreated PTSD, and was just happy to just, take my insurance and take notes and be judgy. Then there's coaching, which I do provide. And if you're interested in coaching to help you through this process, you can email me, john@oaksweightloss.com. And then I'm going to provide a course, right, where I can go as in-depth as I want on all the major topics that would help someone get free of emotional eating. There's tons of different topics, tons of different big light bulb type realizations that I want to help people walk through to shore up their freedom. And I'm going to teach this course for the first time live in a group session. So if you enroll in the course right now, you get to take part in that live training. And at the end of each lesson, I'll pause and you can ask your questions and we can make sure that everybody's, fully understanding everything before we move on. So I'm back to just add a tidbit about how the bigger course is going to work, how the full course is going to work. So I'm taking signups now, gauging interest, making sure that I have enough people
to do a beta where I can teach the course live, learn from the questions, shore everything up, and make sure I have the absolute best product possible to help the most amount of people. So people have been asking about, well, when exactly is it going to be? And that's getting it a little bit out of order. So I just wanted to be clear that this is a pre-order. It seems like there's plenty of interest, but once I just make sure I've got enough people, I will begin the very large task of organizing this course and starting to lay out the course content, curriculum, whatnot. Once I do that, I can figure out exactly how many sessions it's going to be, how long it's going to be. And once I know that, then I can schedule. And I'm going to take into account everybody else's schedule. I'm trying to keep the group manageable so that people can, pick times that work for them. I'm fairly flexible. I can work with whatever the group wants. Somebody might have trouble making it to a live session. Maybe something comes up and somebody thought they were going to be able to make it, but they can't. It's okay if that's the case. If you're really sore about that, we can get you a refund. It's no big deal. But I don't think it needs to come to that, because if you're not there live, you can watch the replay along with all the Q&A for each applicable lesson. So if you watch lesson 4 because you weren't there and nobody at the end asked a question that answers your question, that matches your question, then you can, through the comments, through email, whatever system we have set up, ask me your question, and I can make sure that you get the answers you need. And that way, nobody's left in the lurch. Everybody gets what they need. And honestly, I want your questions, because that's going to help me. So I have no interest in leaving anybody in the lurch. I would prefer to do it live, but it's not absolutely necessary that everybody would have to be there live for every single one. And there might be a possibility to have sort of a group discussion beneath each video where people could come back and post their thoughts in the days afterward. Could be some cool little community building within that as well. So that's what the plan is. This is a soft launch of a course, a beta launch as they call it, and it's the best way to make the best course possible. Yes, I could go and just make the course, have it all done, charge the full price, right? But then you guys don't get in for cheap, and I don't get your feedback. So this is a win-win for everybody, and I hope you'll take part. If you have any questions, please let me know. Please email me, YouTube, Facebook, wherever you are, you can write in the comments. But if for whatever reason I don't see that, you can always email me, john@oaksweightloss.com. So I hope that clarifies things, alleviates any concerns. Worst case scenario, you're getting a hell of a deal just by pre-ordering. Even if you didn't take part in any of the beta stuff, you would still be getting an insane deal. So back to the other video.
Once finished, you will get, the nice polished version of the course, which will eventually sell for hundreds of dollars, $600,000, $800,000 or something. If you enroll today, you're only going to pay $149. And like I said, you will get the nice, fancy, polished course as well. I don't know if it's be fancy. It might have like better slides than than this, but certainly it's cheaper to get it today. So I'm going to throw a link into the chat where you can check this out into the comments. And so I'm going to actually go to my Facebook and walk you through this. Okay, so you're seeing my view of the group. Here's what it looks like. Here's our live thingamajig. All right, so here's the link. So I'm going to click this link, and this is going to take us to the payment processor. Okay, we have the emotional eating course beta. Here's where you type in your email. Here's where you enter your card information, expiration date, that little 3-digit code on the back of your card, your name, your country or region, and your zip code. And then if you click that button, it'll make it faster and easier. And then after you click pay, it'll take you to a confirmation page. And that's basically going to say that once you sign up, I will send you an email. I don't have it automated, so I'm going to do this manually in batches, but I will get that email to you within 24 hours of you signing up. Trust me, it's coming. I'm not going to leave you hanging. And that email is going to have all the information that you're going to need to take part in the live training. I haven't scheduled it yet. I'm, making sure people are interested in it first, but that email is going to have everything you need to know. All right, well, that's our webinar. And I think we came in at just an hour on the dot. Stuck the landing like Carrie Strug. The little girl with the broken ankle. Anyways, on that note, thank you for joining me. I hope you got a lot out of this. I hope that hey, if you didn't understand every single tidbit of this, there's going to be a replay. I just hope that really this gives you hope that there's a whole other avenue for change that doesn't require these things that have not been serving you for your entire life. I wish you well. I hope that this helped. If it did help, please tell me in the comments. I would really appreciate it. I'm going to look through there later. So for now, that's all. Thank you and goodbye.